We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. This is, I think, the last session for today, and I'm very excited about this panel and the conversation that's about to ensue. So some of you may be familiar with IDSS and its initiative around combating systemic racism and thinking more intentionally, more strategically about how to design computational models and systems to address systemic forms of inequality. And of course, this has become a timely initiative given a lot of the conversation in this country around the sort of investments in AI and automation systems, but more importantly, their adoption in sort of high stakes context. Think healthcare, think policing, employment, the credit markets. And so this is a very timely and important subject. And so we're excited here to sort of share with you some of the research that's happening here and elsewhere as it relates to this attempt to sort of understand how we shift this conversation away from sort of modest and vague references to fairness to really thinking more about some of the equity and justice considerations associated with these systems and their impacts in the real world. So with that, we will turn it over and get started with Fotini.
Thank you so much, Craig. So I would like to say hello to everyone. I'm Fotini Christia, a professor of political science and also associate director at IDSS. And I wanted to start really briefly by giving a bit of an overview for how this initiative started. So I joined IDSS in October 2020 in my role as associate director. And right before that, I served on a committee that was trying to think of how to further engage social sciences at IDSS. So ICSR was very much born from that process, and I'll illustrate a little bit what went through this thinking. But I did want to say that since this is an opportunity for us to also celebrate Munzer, that I feel like it has really taken off in this past year and a half because of the very particular sensibility he has brought to this. And specifically, I think it's definitely the leadership style he lives by, the fact that he generally likes to identify the most talented people that work on these issues and then convince them to come and actually join him in the initiative. Then the fact that he rules by committee and not by decree. So this is all a very participatory process, and I think this will be very obvious also for this specific initiative. And the fact that he likes to engage on the individual level with all the faculty, all the students, all the staff. So I think the reason why within a year and a half we've seen what I think is a great level of engagement and interesting output and a lot of excitement across campus and beyond is very much has to do with what he has brought to the table. So, yeah. So, I mean, the motivation, as Craig suggested, and Craig was actually working with us from the very beginning on this, so it's an honor that he has come back to join us for this celebration, is that it was obviously a response to the national and international outcry for police brutality and the murder of George Floyd. But it was generally a recognition of the fact that, you know, race is something that affects life outcomes in all possible ways, especially in the US, but across the globe. Life expectancy, income, education, where people live, and just the fact that it's obviously a very complex matter has kept a lot of us away from wanting to study it, and especially the issue of racism in the US is something that many people understand is extremely important, but weren't even sure how to get started with it. So what I think the sensibility that IDSS wanted to bring to this was to try to understand it not just as prejudice, but basically as part of a racialized social system. So I appreciate why it's important to take this systemic stance in trying to address it, and also think about it in terms of bringing together interdisciplinary teams with colleagues across schools at MIT, and also trying to understand how to address this through a causal inference lens as a way to take kind of a more a broader sense of idea of how to deal with these questions. And we've ended up looking at things in policing, housing, healthcare, social media, as well as gaming and virtual reality. And Peko, who will come right after me, will give us a slightly deeper dive on the healthcare vertical. And I'm excited to also see Deva Vrat in the front row, who's been very engaged in the policing vertical, among others. So basically, the mission of ICSR is really to coordinate this cross-disciplinary research across MIT. And it has engaged faculty, researchers, both on the graduate and undergraduate level, as well as research scientists and students from across the institute. And though it's very much focused on data, it doesn't take kind of an agnostic approach, but it very much draws on existing on decades of existing literature on race and racism from the social sciences, and also tries to think of what it is in new existing methods that we can bring to this conversation to push the agenda forward. So the research is also very much informed by local stakeholders and shared with stakeholders. So in that sense, there's also a community participation aspect to it. And I think Peko can illustrate some of that as well through the healthcare effort. So the steering committee includes colleagues from all MIT schools. And at the time when we formed this, my colleague Melissa Nobles was the dean of SHAS. She has now moved in her new role as chancellor, but is still very much engaged in the initiative and heads the steering committee, and again, colleagues from across the 5 schools. And we've also managed to engage colleagues that visit from outside schools but are present in the MIT community, like Craig when he was here as an MLK scholar, but as well as students and colleagues from other universities. We, for instance, in the policing group, we've engaged with sociology professors from Harvard, one of our graduates who is now at the Naval Academy, and other scholars who work at IBM or Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera. So this research basically, as I said, in this interdisciplinary approach, it really tries to bring together humanists and social scientists, but also researchers with extensive expertise in causal inference, algorithms, and mechanism design. So we find that this approach is very MIT, and hopefully it can help. Some of the findings can help policymakers to think through a lot of these existing challenges. So I already alluded to the different verticals that exist at MIT, and obviously these are only a small set of issues where racism is prevalent in the US, but they represent research agendas and interests among our faculty, so these were kind of organically put together. And to date, we've had 65 researchers across the 5 schools engage, including 27 faculty, 32 students and postdocs, 4 students who are MSRP. It's the summer program for minority students to engage, 2 MLK fellows and an incoming MLK fellow in the next year. There are the 5 research verticals that I spoke about, 16 distinct research projects, 6 publications to date, including other conference presentations. And we also have a podcast that allows us to popularize some of these findings, and a lot of events that happen across campus with people from campus and outside engaged. We also have an edited volume on systemic racism and computation that features essays from my social science faculty on an array of issues around systemic racism, and then responses from computational faculty in what they think, how big data and computation can kind of build off of existing literature and get us thinking about research. Craig and Charles and Tawana are MLK fellows that are engaged, and MIT has been gracious to feature us in the initiative in an array of different new species, as well as a lot of the research outputs, actually, which has been something we have appreciated and has increased the number of Europe's undergrad research assistants who've been actively engaging in the project by finding out more about this. So now I'm going to pass it on to Peko for the housing, some of the housing research. Thank you.
Okay, I got a lesson on how to do this, and I already can't find my slides. Yes? Okay, excellent. Thanks, Fotini. So I'm going to talk about the housing vertical. And I do need to acknowledge two people who are not in my slides. One is Catherine D'Ignazio from DUSP, who has been co-leading this with me and has been fantastic. She's on sabbatical, so she's not here right now. And the other is Craig, who has been with us from the first day and has been working with us and our students for the entire time he was visiting at MIT. So I couldn't be more delighted to have him back. Okay, so let me start this. So this is a photo of a march by a number of civil rights leaders in Chicago in 1966, and it's a march to end discrimination in housing. And so, pop quiz for all of you in the audience: find Martin Luther King and find Jesse Jackson. So they're famous people in this slide. And so I put this up just to illustrate how long we've been working on this problem, how long this has been an issue. And as you'll see, we still have a long ways to go. Two of the things that I learned very quickly when I started working on the issues in housing is that there's a couple of things that make housing a little bit unique in my mind. The first is that housing security, if you don't have housing security, you have a problem in almost all other aspects of your life, right? It's hard to be in good shape with employment, health, safety, education. All of those things are hard to maintain if you don't have secure housing, right? So if you're going to address equity in any of those axes, you need to somehow address the housing issue first. The second thing, which was a little bit less obvious to me, is that in this country, we tend to build wealth by investing in our houses, right? Most of you in the audience, okay, not the graduate students, but everybody else in the audience, you probably have your wealth in your house and in your 401k, and then everything else is epsilon on top of that, right? So in order to get access to wealth, you sort of have to have access to the housing market, and it's of course well known that there's an enormous racial wealth gap in this country. So this is people report this in lots of different ways. There's lots of different ways you can measure wealth, but just about every metric you look at, there's about an order of magnitude difference between black families and white families. Okay, so and in order to address this, it's hard for me to imagine how you address this if you don't address the homeownership problem. So those are the kinds of things we're thinking about. I have two big points I want to make before we get onto the discussion. And the first one is that distributions matter. So I'm gonna illustrate this with a really sort of a toy problem, just so you can understand how you can get feedback loops in the system. So this data comes from the HMDA data set. So the HMDA is the Home Mortgage Disclosures Act data set, and it basically has data on every mortgage that people have applied to in the United States for the last, I don't know, one of my students here can tell me, 15 years or something like that, since 2000. More than 15 years. So this is for Boston, and this is the probability distribution of white borrowers on a loan-to-value ratio. So the loan-to-value ratio, this tells you how much are you putting as a down payment when you're applying for a mortgage. So if you're at 100, that means you're taking out 100% of a loan. You haven't put down any down payment. If you're at 80, then you've put down a 20% down payment. You're asking for 80% in a loan. Okay. Okay, so you can measure these probability distributions. And so imagine that I'm a bank and I make the following sort of simple algorithm to decide whether or not to give people a loan. And I just say, okay, people need some skin in the game. So I'm going to say, if you put down 80+%, or 20+%, I'm going to approve you. And if you don't put that down, I'm going to deny you. Okay, which seems perfectly fine and doesn't seem to have any racial biases in it. There's nothing, I haven't said anything about race so far. And it is fine until you put the distribution of black borrowers on top of this. Because I've told you, there's more wealth in the white community than in the black community. So it's easier for white borrowers to make that down payment. And so now, if I use that algorithm to give out loans, I am preferentially lending to white borrowers. So that means that the white borrowers can now invest in a house, so they can now build wealth through their home ownership, which now feeds back into this distribution and makes it worse. And so I'm sure everybody in here can think of different algorithms we could have used to fix this. But the point I want to make here is that if you are not very conscientious about thinking about how race is impacted in these decisions, it is very easy to put in a feedback loop that drives these distributions apart rather than moving them together. Right? So that's one of the big messages that I want you to take away from this. And I think data can help us understand what kinds of policies are going to move this in the right direction. The second problem with distributions is that it's known, and this is provable mathematically, that if you have two different distributions, it is impossible to satisfy all of the fairness metrics. They're incompatible. Okay, so that means we're going to do something unfair because we have these underlying different distributions. And so in that case, what does it actually mean to make a fair or a just decision? So one of the things that we're thinking about, Aurora in particular, who's on this slide, is thinking about if we're given this data, this HMDA data, so we know what the distributions look like, what is the best we can do in the sense of, let's say I pick one fairness metric I want to satisfy, how badly am I violating the others? Right, and unless you change the distribution, you can't do any better, no matter what your algorithm is. Okay. So this is sort of a measure of, given the situation we are in, how problematic is it? Okay. So that's one thing. So distributions matter. The second message I wanted to make is that these distributions didn't just sort of spring out of thin air, right? They came from something, and these distributions came from this historical context where there have been policies that have been going on for decades, which have led to these distributions. And I'm going to put up a quote by LBJ, and I'm going to read the quote because I think it's actually really important, and I think it comes back to Munzer's triangle. So I'm going to tie this back to the triangle in a minute. So here's the quote. Okay, so the quote is, imagine a 100-yard dash in which one of two runners has his legs shackled together. He's progressed 10 yards while the unshackled runner has gone 50 yards. At that point, the judges decide the race is unfair. How do they rectify the situation? Do they merely remove the shackles and allow the race to proceed? Then they could say that equal opportunity now prevailed, but one of the runners would still be 40 yards ahead of the other. Would it not be the better part of justice to allow the previously shackled runner to make up the 40-yard gap or to start the race all over again? Right, and so this is where we are. This is why the historical context matters. And I think one of the big challenges in this field is a lot of the metrics for fairness just say, I'm going to take a snapshot of where we are now, and I'm going to treat like alike. And if you do that, you've missed the historical context. Okay, and the reason I think this ties back to the triangle. So remember, the triangle is people, institutions, and systems, right? And I think that, historically we've always thought of racism as a people problem, people treating other people badly. And there's lots of people have thought about this, about, things we can do to help people treat people better. And more recently, we've come to realize that that's actually not the big issue here. The big issue here is institutions. What I showed you there are feedback loops where institutions, even though there's no race in the policy, there are institutions, policies that are somehow exacerbating these differences in the distributions. And now I'm going to say that the thing we have to add, which I think has not been added in the conversation yet, is the systems piece, right? So we've talked about people, we've talked about institutions, and so now I'm going to say, actually what we need to be thinking about is systems, because we need to think about how do we take those two distributions, which are in the middle of a dynamical system. There's the dynamical system. They're evolving over history because of the policies we're putting in place. How do we put in policies such that those distributions are driven towards the same fixed point rather than driven away from each other? Okay, and I have 1 more minute. All right, I didn't even know there was a timer back there. That's great. Okay, all right. I've now made the points I want to make. I'm going to put up 2 more slides, which are important because so this one is I'm going to talk a little. I'm going to say Craig's going to ask some questions, and I'm going to use this example to answer the question. And I mostly put it up so you could see Tala, who's sitting back there, if you want to ask more questions about this. And the last one point I want to make is that I think we've learned that local partnerships are really important in this space, and talking with people who are living this experience and understanding what parts of these policies really are having an impact on their lives. So we have a terrific partnership with Campfield Estates, which is an affordable housing unit in South Boston, and Jola and Nolan are doing a project around participatory action research with them, and I see Nolan's back there as well. You should feel free to talk to him if you want to learn more about that. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, so now find mine. There it is. And that. And what's up there? Yes, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about structural injustice than systemic injustice, but I can kind of riff a little bit on it because I work on both of them, both on gender and race, disability, and other issues. Oh, yes, so I do normative theory, and what I wanted to say is interdisciplinary conversations are really hard. And most of the people here do empirical work, and I do normative work, and sometimes it's hard to talk across these differences. And I've learned a lot today just being here, but there are moments where I'm thinking, oh my gosh, where do we connect? And so some of this may be fairly obvious to you, that I'm saying things you already know, but I don't know if you know it. And some of it may be like, whoa, this is totally not relevant, but we're doing our best at doing an interdisciplinary conversation. Okay, so questions of equity and justice. So what does justice require, and how does equity figure into it? And this slide is really part of a slide to tell you that philosophers have been working on this in very many different parts of the world for thousands of years. It's not a new question. There are lots of different views about it. I'm going to canvass a few answers that just start from Kant, but Kant, Locke, Mill, Rawls, et cetera, et cetera. So Kant thought treating people as moral equals, as ends in themselves and not as mere instruments. So we are all sources of value. We're able to create value by our valuing of things in a certain way. And so we have to respect and value that in each other. And one of his second versions of the categorical imperative is always treat others as ends in themselves and not merely as means. Now, what does that mean? Okay, good question. Granting individuals equal rights, sort of to what? That's a kind of John Stuart Mill thing and John Locke. Distributing the benefits of joint cooperation equally. Notice these are all sort of trying to involve equality and justice, but in very different ways. Rawls thought that inequalities could be justified except if they benefited the least well off. So he was a kind of quasi-egalitarian, because he thought if you distributed things unequally, that would raise all the boats, let's put it that way. Ensuring equal access to a good or meaningful life. I think of Sen as doing that kind of work, and requiring all social relations to be compatible with democratic equality. So I'm giving you a sense, this is really hard. It's really hard to think about what justice requires. It's really hard to think about how equity is involved in justice. So let's think about how this might connect to social groups, such as racial groups. So ideal theories of justice, as the ones just described, tend to consider individuals as such without regard to their race, ethnicity, gender, disability, religion, etc. Each individual, regardless of their group membership, is entitled to justice. But when we look at injustice and think about how to remedy it, group membership seems to matter a lot. Individuals have been and continue to be treated differently depending on their social group membership. So reparative justice may need to diverge from the idea that we treat everybody equally to something like equity. And I hope you've all seen this before. I mean, that's the equality, equity, liberation. The fence is made by humans, and it gets in the way, and we try to compensate for it, but really we need to take the fence down. Moreover, individuals in different groups have their own history, values, culture, and want and need different things, so we should not assume that equal treatment equals the same treatment. And I think this comes up in thinking about optimality. Optimality for whom? Whose values are implicitly embedded in this notion of efficiency or optimality? I think that's really a hard question. So the idea of oppression emerged because there was this focus on injustice and injustice or harms to groups. Racial oppression concerns the oppression of non-white people. Gender oppression concerns the oppression of non-cis men. And this is sometimes expressed by the claim that oppression is group-based. But we have to distinguish two forms of group oppression, and Peko was just talking about this. I'm just going to do a philosopher thing with it. The first is the discrimination model. Group-based oppression occurs when individuals are targets of wrongful treatment because of or on the basis of their group membership. So I treat you differently because of your race. You treat me differently because of my gender. We treat undocumented people differently because of their lack of citizenship. And the model tends to focus on individuals as the source of the wrongful treatment, oftentimes in the psychology of members of the privileged group. And the question then is this group-based bias encoded in AI, et cetera, and how can that be avoided? So this discrimination model is, I think, a dominant model within American politics. The other model is the sort of social formation model. The social formation model is one in which the group in question is constituted within an oppressive structure or system. The oppressed groups are those who occupy positions or nodes in the structure. So class is going to be the paradigm example. Class oppression of workers happens because it's part of the structure of capitalism that labor must be exploited to gain profit. That's just the structure of the system. That's the structure of market capitalism. And, I could say, it doesn't matter. Employers don't have to hate their employees, right? Oftentimes they have great respect for their employees, but still the employees are exploited. The employees may not feel like they're exploited. When you ask them, are you exploited? They may say no, but they're still exploited, right? It's not about what's in the head. It's about how the structure sort of disadvantages and advantages people. So it would be odd to say, for example, that capitalism discriminates based on class, as if there's a working class independent of capitalism, and capitalism discriminates against them. Capitalism is an oppressive system that produces wage workers and capitalists, right? It produces them. That's what the system does. Okay, so the structure or system is the source of the injustice, not biased attitudes. And some people think that the biased attitudes sort of frame puts you in ethics, which is about what should I do and what should you do and how should we interact, where the justice frame is a political frame. It's about the structure of our society and how we should collectively govern ourselves. And so the social formation model puts us into the justice realm rather than just, how can you be good? Maybe do some implicit bias training, right? Implicit bias training is not the solution. It may be good, but it's not the solution. So social group formation in general need not be oppressive if the social relations making up the structure are good and just. Okay, so importantly, the discrimination model and the social formation model call for different normative analyses. Consider, was the wrong of chattel slavery a matter of racial discrimination? Well, yeah, kinda. But because slaves were racialized as black, but the moral wrong is not simply that there was racial discrimination in populating the class of slaves. The structure of chattel slavery and its creation of the master-slave relation was wrong. So the two models of discrimination and social formation are compatible and build on each other. Once a social group is constituted, members of the group are also discriminated against, and there's a loopy interaction between the two. So let's look at the loop. So consider the social construction of race. People talk about social construction all the time, but it's pretty unclear, I think, in much of the literature and much of the conversation, what that means. Here's one model of social construction. Let color be the markings of individuals in a context taken to be evidence of their ancestry in a particular geographical region at a point in history. So skin color, hair texture, eyelid shape, color in scare quotes is going to be the relevant term there, because it's not always skin color. Okay, so races as social groups are produced by the use of color to differentiate roles in a division of labor, chattel slavery, colonialism, and we could extend it beyond the division of labor, but that is one of the main places where it has historically been used. Okay, so discrimination and social formation loop and entrench oppression, because color marking and discrimination are used to produce and uphold unjust structures of labor practices, and that produces race, right? So the color, right, that's something that's just kind of about our bodies, not completely, but a little bit. But race then uses that as a basis for differentiating how people should be treated. So racial groups are formed and systematically disadvantaged, and this creates patterns of wealth, education, housing, and health. And members of racial groups are then discriminated against because of the resulting differences in wealth, education, et cetera. So what happens is that you end up in a disadvantaged position, and then that's held against you. And that reinforces the idea that this is where you belong because, you know, whatever you've had happen to you is about you and not about the structure. So there's a loopiness. So just very, very briefly, and these are all questions because I'm not proclaiming here that I can tell you how to do your job. I don't know how to do your job. So I'm just going to ask a few questions. Do the empirical data speak for themselves? I think not. I mean, of course, what questions we ask, what data we collect is normatively loaded, right? You ask some questions and not others. You do it in some terms and not others. They can also tell us about differences between racial groups, but do they tell us how those differences were created through systems of domination? And do they tell us what is possible going forward in terms of options for liberation? So I think oftentimes what you get is data that's collected assuming certain background structures, and then there's projections of what will happen assuming those background structures. But the question needs also to be, why do we have those background structures, and should we dismantle those background structures? Do the patterns in how we think and talk about, what do the patterns in how we think and talk about race reveal? So I'm thinking about, ChatGPT and others that are looking at these huge data about what people say and think. And I think they tell us about how racial ideology or ideologies of color and labor work, but do they tell us about the distortions of that ideology? I think, for example, we're not always the best judges of our own motivations. We don't, I should go into philosophy of mind here, but I don't. To asking people what they prefer or what they think or et cetera, they don't always know what they prefer because, maybe they haven't had that many options. Okay, and do these patterns that we find tell us what we ignore and why? So what would liberatory AI look like? So this is my question. What would liberatory AI look like? Not optimizing AI, not AI that just gives us a model of how the world works, but is actually liberatory, not only for race, but for other social categories such as gender, disability, economic class, and citizenship. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm having issues with which one?
Just view from PDF in the full screen.
Yeah, that's what I did.
Yeah, I think it just takes a moment after you put it on.
I should just wait. Okay.
Turn off the previous. Is it different? You want to close the previous one, maybe?
Okay, great. So, in deciding what to talk about in the 10 minutes that I have, I decided to structure my talk around one of the questions that Craig, our moderator, had shared with us ahead of the panel, which was about the way the work at IDSS has shifted from fairness in AI to equity and justice. So this resonated with me a great deal because taking my own research as a microcosm of the field, which has come to be known by some as AI ethics and fairness, accountability, and transparency, or FACT by others, I could see the exact same transition over time. So I thought I would tell you about this evolution and what I think are the urgent directions to pursue in the coming years. Now, a spoiler alert, as the title suggests, I'm going to tell you that promoting fairness and justice through AI will require us to strengthen the governance ecosystem around these technologies, but I will try to unpack what I think that should look like. So a couple years ago, say in 2017 or 18, I would have started my talk with this slide. You can see media articles documenting and reporting the unfair disparities that the use of AI in socially high-stakes domains could give rise to, and these stories firmly established the need for the machine learning community to go beyond basic accuracy metrics and traditional evaluation paradigms if our goal is to make these technologies useful in social domains. For example, we must carefully define and promote social values and desiderata such as fairness and non-discrimination when it comes to using machine learning for automating or assisting high-stakes decisions. Now, early on, my own work in this area focused on bridging the gap between mathematical formulations and algorithmic interventions for fairness, which was proposed at the time by the machine learning community, and the concepts such as distributive justice, equality of opportunity, welfare, and inequality from political philosophy and economics. For example, we showed that common mathematical notions of fairness at the group level are mathematically equivalent to specific instances of economic measures of equality of opportunity, and we argued that this mapping allows us to identify the normative assumptions underlying different fairness notions and allows us to examine the appropriateness of those more normative assumptions given the decision-making context at hand. And this is important in light of the fairness impossibility results that Peko mentioned in her talk. Now, the work up to this point obviously just focuses on very narrow definitions of outcome fairness, and it does not get at procedural and social justice considerations, which Sally talked about in her talk, and obviously those are oftentimes much more salient and consequential for stakeholders. But for now, let's just go with this, let's bracket that for the second, and suppose we really care about addressing these outcome disparities. So what should we do about them? Does it, for example, suffice to add a fairness constraint to our risk minimization pipeline? And the short answer is no. Ideally, we should trace back the disparity to its root causes in the machine learning pipeline and intervene at the source. And that's one major focus of my research, to understand how the variety of choices we make in the machine learning pipeline can generate and amplify biases that lead to problematic outcomes at the end of the pipeline. For example, if we focus on the problem formulation, the first stage of the machine learning pipeline, one crucial choice that we implicitly make as soon as we start working with a given data set is that we take the way that data set operationalizes constructs of importance in our decision making, and we take those operationalizations as valid. Now, this is a question that we should really address carefully. Are the way we are operationalizing construct of interest valid? And here I'm thinking about the terminology of validity in its social science interpretation, which is much more nuanced than our notions of validity, things such as cross-validation in machine learning. So our work here started by developing a validity protocol for data-driven modeling using machine learning in socially high-stakes domains. But zooming out even further, machine learning technology is often embedded in a complex system of social entities and stakeholders who may hold competing goals and values. And here is an image I've put together to organize things in my own head. And for example, thinking about the institutional decision makers that decide whether AI could be beneficial in their use cases, does the validity protocol I just talked about provide them with the appropriate support and scaffolding that they need? So this was my entry into talking to practitioners and decision makers on the ground. Now, fast forward to 2022-23 and the rise of generative AI models, which obviously took the world by the storm. So my immediate reaction at this point was that so far we have been just trying to scratch the surface of what it takes to promote values such as fairness and transparency for much simpler learning models. As I hope you saw, deciding the proper scope of the system in which we need to situate and examine them is not a trivial task. Now we have to deal with this generative AI phenomenon, where potential use cases are much harder to enumerate, and as a result, it's much more challenging to demarcate the appropriate boundaries of the system in which generative AI is to be evaluated. What does it even mean to evaluate these systems? Now, the work that has been happening in the AI ethics research area, I think, stays highly relevant. For one thing, everything that we thought as a research community could go wrong with large language models in terms of possible risks and harms has found new instantiation in just the past couple of months, as you can see here. Now, the conclusion I'd like to draw here is that we can have all the principles, frameworks, metrics, and tools in the world, but it does not seem to be making much of a difference when it comes to important decisions on the ground. Consider, for example, the call to release large language models recently in a virtually unrestricted manner, allowing imaginations to run wild about artificial general intelligence, personification, and so on and so forth, and before we figure out a meaningful way of evaluating them, a meaningful paradigm for evaluating them. Now, from my vantage point, we are reaching near consensus that we need more robust governance mechanisms in place to align practice and incentives with responsible R&D and use around artificial intelligence. Unfortunately, we are witnessing a great deal of activity, both at the state, federal, and even international level in this regard, and I think one contribution we can offer as experts is to seriously engage with these policymaking efforts and ensure that they reflect state of the art. In the near term, though, and in our capacity as researchers and educators, I keep asking myself, how can we contribute to a richer ecosystem of accountability and governance? And I'd like to close by offering two proposals. The first one, I believe it is essential that we ground our research, our machine learning research, in real-world practical uses of the technology. And second, I argue that we should take seriously our responsibility to educate tomorrow's practitioners and engineers who will be positioned to influence consequential decisions in the machine learning lifecycle. So having interacted with practitioners and decision makers in both public and private sector to understand their practices and challenges around AI governance, what we have observed is that the technical knowledge and expertise is one among many considerations that they need to account for in deciding whether and how to build AI in their own use case, in their use cases and workflows. Beside that, they need to navigate a very complex web of relationships internally, including with their own frontline workers, developers, and leadership, and externally with impacted communities, media, and government. So speaking of participatory approaches, one desire that we keep hearing from practitioners on the ground, especially in the public sector, is to meaningfully engage with the impacted community members and ensure that the AI that gets procured or designed and built addresses the needs and values of those impacted by the system. Now, one key question here is obviously how can we operationalize this idea of participation? Do structured elicitation mechanisms suffice? They may have a place, I argue, but we need a richer set of criteria to evaluate the proposed participatory approaches, and here you can see a set of criteria we have recently put together to do this assessment. Last but not least, as educators, I think we should ensure that our students, our machine learning and AI students, have the right set of normative frameworks as well as technical tools to systematically think through new use cases. And toward this goal, my group has recently started doing classroom experiments to scientifically evaluate the educational material I use in my own course, for example, called Machine Learning, Ethics, and Society. And here, for instance, you can see how my students' perceptions of urgency of values changed as they interacted with the AI incident database, which documents all the ways in which the use of AI in society has gone wrong. As you can see, they started caring much more about reliability, robustness, accountability, and governance compared to some of the other values that the research community has been prioritizing lately. Okay, so let me stop here. I hope this provided a high-level overview of the research area and where I hope the field is headed. Thanks, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Okay, like we've done most of the day, we'd like to open it up for questions or reflections if you would like to respond to the panel. But I'll get us started, and feel free to come up to either mic, to your left or your right. In her opening remarks, or in your opening remarks, Fotini, you sort of noted how it was important from Manza's perspective and the group that really helped to sort of push this initiative forward to do it in a way, right, that was conversational with different kinds of expertise, sort of interdisciplinary expertise, bringing different perspectives, different kinds of forms of knowledge, to this conversation, to this work. So as you've likely heard here, right, just these four sort of really excellent sort of observations. When we think about, right, this shift from fairness in AI to really thinking about equity-centered or justice-oriented AI, the problems are really nuanced and they're extraordinarily complex, right? They're technical and computational. As many of you have noted, Peko, as you suggest, they're also historical, and both you and each of you talk about the degree to which these decisions and the approach to designing AI systems in this way as historical, political. Sally, you sort of mentioned, right, this sort of normative sort of stakes that are also implicated here. And so it really sort of, I think, kind of illustrates why the approach that has been taken here is really the approach to take, that you really can advance equity-centered AI without having this kind of interdisciplinary conversation, bringing different kinds of expertise, to this project. And I think what we're seeing, right, is sort of advancing our knowledge and understanding of just how we ask the questions that might someday allow us really to start generating outputs, systems that can impact in the ways that have been illustrated here. I'd like to ask each of you to sort of think about in your own respective work any one of these different dimensions, right, in terms, because I suspect, right, there's students out here who are interested in this work, doing this work oftentimes in partnership with many of us. Maybe you could each talk a bit about a specific challenge, right? It may be a philosophical challenge, it may be a technical, computational challenge, a historical challenge. What have you found particularly difficult in terms of advancing this work forward? And maybe speak a little bit about how you and or your teams have addressed those specific challenges.
I don't even know which challenge to pick. It's been so challenging. I mean, I guess I'll say, okay. Let me make two comments. So the first is that when I jumped in on this, having that partnership with Catherine, who was faculty at DUSP, was absolutely essential. I mean, I think coming from a data background, having Catherine's contextual expertise was really essential to even jump in on the housing question. But to come back to it, so Craig is a very good moderator, so he sent us these questions in advance. And he sent this question saying about this shift from fairness to the perspective of fairness to equity and justice. And my challenge with that question is, and I think this is one of the big challenges we face, is I think each of these communities which have to come together to solve these problems hear different things when you hear the word fairness, equity, and justice. And I think it's actually a different problem than the communication problem that you have like between different engineering disciplines, where you say, oh, you need to connect the flubert to the red flange, and you think, oh, I don't know what a flubert is. I better ask a question about that. Here, if I say something about fairness, people don't even know to ask the question because you're just hearing something different and you assume that we have the same definitions of fairness, equity, and justice. So to me, that was one of the hardest things to start with, and I don't think I'm there yet. Like, I need to take Sally out to coffee many times to understand, to figure out where that the intersection is coming from a math background and coming from a philosophy background.
So, is it on? Yeah, okay. I actually wanted to thank Hoda because I think she did quite a bit of service to all of us by clearly showing how initially, everybody was thinking about fairness, at least in this kind of computational context, as debiasing the algorithm. So everybody was just so focused on taking algorithms and figuring out how to debias them. And we thought that this was, we were fixing things by doing that. And it's like, oh no, there are all these different aspects on the ML pipeline where bias is creeping. And if you're trying to think about these properly, you have to, interrogate all these different aspects. And I feel like in that sense, not knowing where to start is a good thing in the sense that there's a lot of different aspects we could be looking at, including the regulatory one that you mentioned. For instance, in some of the work we were running an experiment in trying to see how people would whether they would choose to dispatch in emergencies just police or police plus mental health experts in trying to address an array of different scenarios. And we were using medical experts and then kind of just average, kind of representative sample of average individuals who are not medical experts. And it seemed like even though people were making non-biased decisions on average, once they had an AI proposal, some machine tell them what to do, they were actually acting in a biased fashion. So this idea of like, making sure how you deploy these tools and how they get regulated and an extra layer of, complexity. So in some of the, what's next, I think this idea of unpacking the ML pipeline and thinking of the whole process throughout, but also understanding to what degree you can be introducing things like, causal inference as a way to think through these processes and to address some of these matters. And again, appreciating the system and the ecosystem in how all of this works, I feel are some of the steps. So I agree that, where do we even start? But different aspects, the low-hanging fruit of like debias the algorithm is definitely behind us. I think that would have been the 2017 opening slide for some of us as well.
So thank you everyone, and for having me here. One of the big challenges I have is that it's very difficult to talk about value and valuing in a way that doesn't either get, we don't talk about that, we just talk about preferences, because, preferences are okay because you're just respecting individuals and their preferences and it's not really value laden. Footnote, yes it is. Or else it's like, you must be talking about these absolute values of religion or something like that, and there aren't any absolute values. And I think it's really difficult to come into a space where when you're talking about equity and justice, you're talking about values. And it's very hard to know how to think about value, but it's not anything goes, and it's not people's preferences, because people have stupid preferences, right? And even if you try and correct them with more information, they're not necessarily interested in anybody else's good but their own, and they're maybe not interested even in their own good, because they're distorting what their sense of the good is. They're adaptive preferences. I mean, preferences are just really unreliable as a basis for judging what's good and bad, especially for collective action and collective organization. So for me, it's really hard, because the minute I start talking about value, people go, oh my God, what is she doing? She's imposing her values on us. And believe me, I'm very sensitive to that problem. And I do think that it's possible to have meaningful conversations about values and how values interact, and how moral judgment is a skill. And I really wish we could have more of those conversations.
Yeah, so I think maybe I can add to this by mentioning something about what I've heard from practitioners. What's difficult for them. One is it is very difficult for them to keep track of what's happening on the research side. What are the kinds of tools, metrics, and ideas available to them that they can actually apply in their practices, and also they don't have the resources and incentives to spend time to actually go look for those tools, try to see whether it works for them, and so on and so forth. And these are well-intentioned practitioners, those who are really interested in making sure that their work at least doesn't amplify existing injustices. And obviously, when you think about the private sector, where the incentives are much more immediate financial gain, things become even less clear. So I think the big challenge I want to highlight is incentives, right? Resources and incentives to align practices with responsible R&D and development.
Can I just comment on Fotini's? I just want to second what Fotini said about debiasing algorithms is not, yes, we should debias our algorithms. But even if you have a perfect algorithm, like the slide I showed with the distributions, let's say I have a perfect algorithm that makes perfect predictions, you're still going to exacerbate the underlying distribution. So debiasing the algorithm, you're sort of treating the symptom, you're not treating the underlying cause. And I think that's one of the things that's become really evident to me in looking at the data.
I want to just follow up really quickly, if I can, about incentives. I like incentives a lot. But I think another dimension of the problem is that all of this takes place against the backdrop of a culture. And when you incentivize people, you're incentivizing them using whatever they take to be good or valuable to get to an end that you take to be good or valuable. And actually, I think cultural change is important as a more stable and enduring sort of solution to the problem. And it may be you need incentives to get people to notice that this is a better, longer term solution to the problem. But again, another thing that gets left out of this is how culture is playing a role. So in those issues about social meaning and the markings of race and the markings of gender and all of this, those are cultural, those are social meanings. And the social meanings are deeply embedded in the culture. And so as we move forward, we've got to find ways to change culture and be critical of the way that it's changing in addition to incentivizing people to change.
You know, one of the things that I really appreciated about the presentations is that you each really began to help us or to illuminate the ways in which systemic forms of inequality actually work and function, how they get operationalized into systems in a way that's structural, in a way that is historical, in a way that sort of just replicates itself almost just by virtue of existing. This particular initiative here at IDSS has, as Fotini noted, is sort of focused on a number of different sort of domains: healthcare, policing. Peko talked about housing. There's certainly others as well. I'm wondering if each of you could maybe talk a bit about, and I appreciate us being sort of critical about, automation, computational systems, the sort of ubiquity of bias across this pipeline, Hoda, as you've noted. But these systems also, if designed effectively, and sort of enhance our understanding and generate insights in terms of how these structural forms of inequality, actually work. And I'm wondering if some of you can maybe give some examples of what you've learned as a result of using data, as a result of sort of analyzing these systems in this way. What have you learned about the operations, the mechanics, the impacts, of systemic forms of inequality?
I went first last time, so someone else can go first this time. I don't want to hog the mic.
You want to know, Sally?
Need data?
Yeah. norms. No, I'm gonna. I mean, Devavrat is in the room and he's been leading that effort. But in the policing context, I think really just appreciating how far back one needs to go in the whole process to try to understand where issues of discrimination and bias start. And I think appreciating that it's not just in the very real interaction between the police officer and the person that's getting stopped on the street, but it's actually even in the reporting level of the 911 call, and not just the decision that the dispatcher makes, but the decision an individual makes to put in that call, and how much more African Americans and Hispanics are getting reported to begin with, and disproportionately so than equivalent than whites, and then in the process also inevitably how much more they get stopped and frisked and inevitably also arrested. So understanding all where this even begins has been fascinating to us, and the opportunity to do this with 911 data, because a lot of these interactions start as a result of these calls, has been fascinating. And also fascinating, obviously, on the level of the interaction and what it means, but also fascinating methodologically, because of what does it mean to be using these methods to try to optimally process this data and solve this type of methodological challenges as well.
So just really quickly, I've really benefited tremendously from starting to think about society as a complex dynamic system. I think that there are a lot of people in philosophy and political science who think, oh, it's just the the government controls everything, or like the institutions control everything, the law controls everything, and it's going, no. And trying to sort of disaggregate the multiple dimensions of in racism, so to speak, and how they interact with each other in these very nonlinear ways, and no one is in control, right? So you can't pass a law and make it all better, right? You can't, to fix this one thing and then make it all better, because it is this very, very complex system. I mean, in a literal sense. And so that's been really, really powerful for me, both in appreciating that some of the things that get disregarded can be pulled into the picture, like culture I was suggesting, or other sorts of things, and get pulled into the picture and play crucial roles in how the system replicates itself.
So I needed a second to think about it, but the more I think about my experience with real-world data, I think, in my experience, we really have a shortage of high-quality data, right? For all the talks of, big data revolution and so on, we have a lot of low-quality observational data, which we can't really do anything with, right? So what we are really in need of is high-quality data that we have obtained in a controlled way, potentially, looking at different types of intervention regimes and so on and so forth. So I think my high level take on the use of data is that, and more broadly, I think the more I've spent time in this area is the more I've appreciated how important it is where we draw the boundaries of the system, right? So it's, especially in societal applications, we as computer scientists are very much used to, close very well-defined systems, and we need that kind of data on that kind of a system to be able to make valid predictions. But in reality, as soon as you start putting this technology in the societal context, you're introducing all sorts of complications, and that's the other thing that I've appreciated the more I've experienced. The more I've gained experience with statistical modeling on the ground in practice.
Yes, so I totally agree with that. There is a lot of data out there, but it's not nice data, right? And I think this comes back to Sandy's question this morning with the statistics panel, which is like, okay, you have these beautiful theorems, but my data doesn't look like that. But I will say one thing that we found, there is a great source of data, which is the census. There's a ton of information in the census. So one of the things we found there is thinking about housing, the question came up on return of investment, right? Because I said, all right, the way you build wealth is you buy a house, and so I can look at the census data and look over the decades and find out what is the return on investment on the house that you bought, and I can look at that for white home buyers, and I can look at that for black home buyers. So we did that, and so imagine you have a white family and a black family, they buy essentially the same house, and you ask, what is the return on investment? And for many decades, the return on investment is the same, as you would expect, because they bought the same house. But there are decades where it's not. There are decades where actually the white home value goes up a lot more than the black home value. And so I took this to, again, my collaborator, Catherine, asked, since she's in urban planning, I said, what's going on? And she said, what decades did they go up? I said, it's the 60s, 70s, and a little bit of the 80s. And she said, well, I don't know what's going on there, but that was a time when we invested a lot in infrastructure, right? And so this was a time when we were injecting money into the system, ideally in a way where we were trying to do things in a benevolent way, and what it did is it widened the wealth gap. Right. And so there are, again, and I think this is, so I'm going to now tie this back to the infrastructure panel. We're about to there's trillions of dollars going out to the door right now in infrastructure spending. And we know we screwed it up last time. So the question is, can we take some of the tools of causal inference and understand what went wrong last time, so we can give you some rules of thumb to not do the same things this time around?
And part of what went wrong last time, right, was the so-called urban renewal and just the displacement of black and brown families, which sort of led to the crisis that you and the team have been looking at. So Fotini, this is directed towards you, but Peko, you'll likely have some perspective, and Sally and Hoda, also feel free. As you sort of take a step back and think about the initiative and kind of the initial vision, and now kind of getting into it and sort of executing, What have you learned more broadly about the initiative, and could you say a little bit about kind of your vision for sort of moving forward with the initiative?
Absolutely. I think having seen it kind of active now for a year and a half, I think discussing, getting to understand where these things interject, like this discussion now between transportation and housing, for example, but generally with our existing verticals, I mean, there's direct connections with healthcare and policing, for instance, that we're finding. And so we are now hosting these lunches where our students meet bi-weekly and kind of discuss the research in an effort to get some of these collaborations going across the different verticals. So this is definitely one thing that we're very keen on. I think building more on the community angle. So the vertical that Peko is leading, I think, is the leader in that sense. So understanding what modes we could be using, because this is a way to bring and address some of what Hoda was saying, bring some of the tools closer to the stakeholders. First of all, understand their questions, make sure we're all kind of speaking the same language in how we define issues, but also communicating back some of the tools that we're devising, some of the findings we're coming up with. So having this kind of feedback loop of what the needs are, how our research connects to the needs, and also who are the stakeholders and policymakers that could be relevant for this. So some of the ideas speak to making sure all the different verticals are speaking to each other, but then also connecting with stakeholders and policy.
Yeah, I really love that this housing vertical and the positioning of some of the researchers actually in this affordable housing residence. I think what we're learning is, as we have this conversation and think about sort of designing this more equitable future as it relates to these systems, it's absolutely imperative that we bring those stakeholders into the conversation. And in addition to sharing our work with them, I think we also benefit greatly from their perspective and their expertise and how that might inform decisions that we make in the work that we do. So I'm sure you're learning a lot just from residents, right, and how that might inform whatever kind of computational or modeling work that you do moving forward.
I also want to put a plug for one of the events tomorrow, but this idea of also tying it with education. So basically, there is an initiative that will be discussed tomorrow in trying to understand how some of these constituents can actually engage in their research themselves by getting trained in these tools and how to use these tools. And I think this idea of basically thinking about the education, thinking about the research, and also potentially even if there's something on the entrepreneurship front that relates, is very much part of the MIT character and kind of vision. So, and we hope to have that reflected in the initiative.
I'm getting the signal that we have. Can we take one question? Okay, sure.
Investing so much in new things, and these new investments could exacerbate some of the differences. And not only looking at racism, but in general socioeconomic disparities across not only the US but the world. I'm being just really concerned about, we're developing all this and deploying all these technologies for climate change. And for a lot of dimensions, going in the green direction is not necessarily going in the wealth or equity or social justice direction. For some countries, it's better to, let's say, develop their wealth with non-green technologies first because it's cheaper. So kind of imposing this new green wave to the whole world at the same time is kind of very unfair. So, and for me, this is I don't even know how to think about it. And this conversation was really insightful in that sense of you need to think about the different dimensions. So I don't know if you have any takes on how do we approach this and what state we are.
In the context of infrastructure, we're a little bit lucky that we've done this in the past. So we have an example that we should be able to learn from if we deploy the tools of causal inference. By the way, causal inference people, I have a question about this, so come talk to me afterwards if you want to work in this space. The question about this sort of balancing green technology with socioeconomic implications, I think that has to come back to what Sally was saying, that we have to be brave enough to have a values discussion. right? And I don't think, that values discussion is not an easy discussion to have, and there's a lot of subtlety around it, which is why I think there's not an obvious answer. And there probably is not a one-size-fits-all answer. Like, oftentimes in these cases, that's just not possible. And comes back to Craig's point, that you have to go back and you have to talk to the communities, and you have to understand the communities, and you have to understand what are the challenges and what are the local things that are important and difficult for them.
I just want to say one quick thing is I went down a rabbit hole on preferences because but I totally believe in situated knowledge and the value of the community and in defining what's good for themselves and enabling autonomy. I just think there's a kind of a strategy of looking at preferences that isn't altogether reliable. But I do think that, yes, this kind of conversation where you're going into the community and working with the community and trying to understand what they value and what matters to them, and hooking that up with the other issues around climate change is really, really important.
Let me add one more thing. There is one place where I think data scientists can be really useful, and that is in quantifying the trade-off so people are making an informed decision when they make those value decisions, right? I think we experienced this all through COVID, right? Where there were a lot of, should we shut things down? Should we wear masks? Should we require vaccinations? All those things. And, and rather than coming out and saying, you must do this, you must do this, you must do this, you can say, all right, here's the model. If you do this, this is the likely outcome. Please make a decision that makes sense for your community now that you have a quantitative estimate of what will happen if you do these things.
Yeah. But there's a worry that if it can't be quantified, it isn't real. And that's not true, right? There are many things that can't be quantified and are still real. And so, and value is especially, if you're a pluralist about value and you don't think there's just a hedonic scale of pleasure or something, it gets really hard because you compare values and they're incommensurable, or you can only get them on a par and you can't get, anyway, so it's tricky.
I agree, it's tricky. But I also think, so I totally agree it's tricky, and we need to go in with our eyes open that not everything, and honestly, there are some things where we could put a value on that we just don't. We're not, for example, there's like your question about the environment. There is a price when we put carbon in the air, which we are not putting into a lot of calculations right now, right? So I think we need to be a little bit braver about what we are willing to quantify, right? But I completely agree that you have to keep in mind there are things that can't be quantified. But to your question, the question about if I'm going to go to green technology and what is the sort of the socioeconomic impact, that is a trade-off we should be able to put rough parameters around, right? And that's a useful thing to know when you're making those decisions.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of the panel, and if I'm not mistaken, the end of day one. So thank you all for your wonderful contributions and your great work.